Yo, what's up guys? It's Talon. Today I have the last role guide. I did make a jungle guide over a year ago, but I decided I should probably update it. So if you guys don't know, I'm a rank 5 sovereign autofill player, hit rank 5 multiple times playing autofill. So I have experience on every role, and that's why today we're going to provide a jungle guide, and I have guides of every other role on my channel if you're interested in any of those. Apart from that, let's just get straight into the video. The first thing that we're going to talk about is champion pool. Typically, I have a distinction between champions, which is ganking versus farming junglers. I feel like that is the most relevant thing to speak about. You could certainly say, you know, assassins versus AP junglers versus whatever, versus tank killers, you know, tanks, whatever. There's all of these things, but generally to me, the easiest and most simple way to break it down that's the most relevant to you guys would be ganking versus farming. So typically, farming junglers are going to be more late game champions who don't have a ton of CC or ways to gank early. Sometimes they have slower clear speeds as well, and generally they're just weaker at the early parts of the game. Whereas ganking junglers, they're a lot stronger early on. They often have good clear speeds, good CC to gank, and are really good at snowballing in general. Now, every jungler is obviously unique. There is a spectrum in terms of how much you lean towards one or the other. For example, just because you do gank a lot as a jungler doesn't mean you need to completely just forget about farming, right? It's always, you know, kind of in between. And then in terms of drafting these champions, typically you're going to prefer to draft ganking junglers. And this could kind of not be exactly true because it's certainly going to depend on a lot of scenarios. But oftentimes a ganking jungler or a jungler who's less reliant on farming is really nice to have when you have late game laners, because then you can help get your laners through the early game. And then you're going to, you know, have that late game insurance policy with your laners while you can sort of facilitate the early game. Whereas playing a farming jungler, you often prefer having stronger laners, because then your laners will have the push in the lane, which means you can't get invaded as easily. Your laners are often going to be more self-reliant, and then you're not going to have to rely on, you know, ganking them. You can kind of focus on your own farm. But oftentimes, if you're playing a ganking jungler with an early game, you know, laners as well, you can snowball the game really well. So you can still play, you know, on one end or the other as well. But typically, that's how I would recommend drafting it. If you prefer one playstyle or the other, I definitely recommend sticking to that. For example, I'm much more of an early game kind of ganking jungle player. I still focus heavily on farming, but I do also like playing those champions that have the ability to gank early on. Apart from that, another thing to note is smite combos. This is something that really is important. Understanding that you need to combo your highest damage ability with your smite to hit objectives at whatever HP that you can. So for example, Camille with her second ability comboed with smite can do about 1200 damage to the objective. It'll do a little over 400 damage with the second ability, and her smite will do a little over, or will do 800 damage. And so finding whatever your best combo is for a champion that you can combine your abilities to smite at a good HP will allow you to hit a lot more smites and secure a lot more objectives. Now let's get into jungle pathing. Okay, so there's a lot that goes into jungle pathing, so we're just going to note the most important things. The first thing is use a control ward on whichever side you are not going to start on. So in this game, I'm starting on red side. So I use a control ward on my blue buff, and then I recall, I get sweeper, and I go to my red side. That is the first thing to note for every clear. The second thing to note for every clear is when you're deciding to start a buff or to start another camp. So you're going to see, for example, here, I'm going to start on a buff. What is the reasoning and the benefit of starting on a buff? If you start on a buff, you then will have a better second clear. The reason for this is it takes 2 minutes and 30 seconds roughly for a buff to spawn, and it takes about 1 minute and 50 seconds for a small camp to respawn. By killing the red buff first, my entire red side will be synced within 30 seconds of, they'll spawn within 30 seconds of each other for the second clear, which makes my second clear much faster. I can come back to this side, just go through the clear really quickly, and then go back to the blue side. So if you want to have a more efficient second clear and you're not worried about the early game as much, then you can do that. If you're a champion with a slower clear, you're going to want to start typically on Krugs, for example, if you start red side. You're always going to start blue buff if you start on blue side, but if you're starting on red side, you would start on the Krugs, the rocks, instead of the red side for a quicker clear, because it is going to be a more efficient, quicker clear. But if you don't need to worry about that as quick clear in the first clear, starting on the red buff is going to give you a better second clear, which is why starting on buffs is my preference unless I really need to get to scuttle really early, or I'm a champion with a really slow clear speed such as Camille. Now deciding on whether you want to start blue side or red side. You're going to start on your blue side if you want to then end up on the red side of the map for an early gank. So typically you want to path towards your strongest laners. So whoever in that lane is going to be in a more advantageous lane, you're going to path towards. Say that you want to path towards the top side, you're going to start on your red buff on your bottom side, so you'll end up, when you're level 5, to be able to gank the top side of the map, and vice versa, of course. The reasoning for playing around your better laners is because it gives you a better advantage for potentially finding an easier gank because the enemy will be lower, contesting the scuttle against someone because you'll have the lane priority for someone to contest. It just generally gives you a much stronger advantage. Now, if you don't always have to path in this way. You don't always need to path towards your stronger laner. Typically, it's going to be nice as a late game farming jungler to just path away from the enemy jungler so that you can have a safe full clear without worrying about getting contested or anything like that. Most jungle champions will start red buff by default. I would say 80 or 90% of the time you can expect red buff to be started by the enemy. And so if you don't know where to start, just start on your own red buff. That way you'll be opposite of the enemy jungler. But if you want to match the enemy jungler because you have the stronger early lanes and you know that you might be able to contest him at scuttle, then you can start blue buff to try to match him. Of course, there's exceptions to this, like Zed, for example, will start blue buff most of the time. Olaf often starts blue buff. Champions like this, but again, if you don't actually know, then just default to thinking they're going to start red buff, and that's going to be really the general way of you just being able to track where the enemy jungler is and decide on where to path. So again, to reiterate, start on the side of the map that will allow you to end up on the opposite side. So if you want to start red buff, then you want to end on the blue side so that you can end up ganking your stronger laner and just path towards your stronger laners. Okay, so the biggest issue for most junglers is not understanding when to farm, when to gank, this type of thing. So first, I'm really going to speak on efficiency, and then we'll speak on deciding when to farm versus gank, deciding when to gank, and these types of things. So it's just generally very important to almost always farm your camps as soon as they're spawning, because farming in that camp as soon as it spawns means the next one respawns quicker, gives you more gold, and jungle is a role which has access to an absurd amount of gold, and so you almost always want to focus on getting those camps pretty much as soon as they spawn. Now, exceptions to this are going to be when the camp or when the objectives are spawning, rather. So if there is an objective spawning, then you can forego your farming and not be quite as efficient because you know that you're probably going to be able to go for the objective and then just farm right after, because obviously objectives are very important. So if you have a chance to play for a dragon or something, it's perfectly okay in that scenario to then give up your farm for a little bit and go and farm it after. But if you don't know what to do, always make sure you're just looking to farm your camps. And make sure when you do clear your camps, you clear all of the camps on the same side of the map at roughly the same time if you can. Because this, again, will sync their next spawn times better together, so then you can farm them all at once rather than having to go back and forth. So oftentimes, say that your blue side's up and your red side's not quite spawning yet. You'll clear your red side, then you'll go look for a gank on the top side. If nothing works out, recall, and then your bot side will start spawning, then you do the same thing. And it's kind of a permanent cycle of this, where you're just kind of looking for a play after clearing, and then if nothing happens, you go other side, back and forth, back and forth. But make sure that you're typically clearing your camps before going for the gank, rather than the opposite way around. Now, there are some exceptions to this, and I'm going to speak about the main things to look for in lanes when determining whether or not you want to gank a lane. So the first thing is going to be looking at your gank setup for your laners. So for example, you might have seen earlier in this clip, I actually forgo a little bit of farm in order to gank mid lane. Now, why is that? That's because Vi Ahri has basically an undodgeable combo where I can ultimate, Vi can ult, charm, insta-death on any squishy champion. And that's exactly what happened. Even though I messed it up, it still worked out. And so in situations like this, when you have really, really good gank setup, if you see an easy gank opportunity, you can go for it. Additionally, looking at the health of the enemy laner is of course very big. If they're very, very low HP, you might again have an opportunity to forgo some farm, as long as you can get in and get out very quickly. Additionally, looking at the wave is very important. For example, say that the wave, your teammate has a huge wave stacked up, and you know that you're going to be able to tank some of the HP of the turret long enough to dive them. Well, then that's going to be a great time to dive because you have a big wave, and diving with the big wave then denies the enemy the big wave. Even if you trade 1-for-1, since they also lose the wave, it's still beneficial. On the other side of things, if the wave is pushing towards your side of the map, it's going to mean that they're going to be a lot easier to gank because they're going to be pushed further up. So that's going to be another scenario where you could potentially look for ganks. All of these things are situational. Keeping in mind the enemy jungle pathing as well is of course something you need to do. So if you know that the enemy jungler is on the same side of the map, then you might want to more wait to just farm your side of the map and look for a counter gank when they show up, rather than trying to force something early, because then oftentimes the enemy will turn on you. All of these various things, but just generally speaking, the main thing to focus on is farm your camps before looking for a gank. Only look for ganks in the scenarios we described, again, when you have good gank setup and these other scenarios with the waves and whatever. It's okay to sometimes just be looking for farm or other things like that rather than overforcing. And then the only real exception to this is if you see a really easy gank opportunity, or if you see an objective spawning soon and you want to, of course, be ready for that objective. Alright, so the next thing is going to be deciding on Herald versus Dragon, and Herald obviously meaning the turret thingy slash the mimics or also if it was Herald. Basically, it's going to be the same thing regardless. So generally speaking, the value in the Heralds, I'm just going to keep calling them Heralds, is getting an early game gold advantage, which is a lot more valuable early on than the dragons. But the dragon, if you get the dragon's soul, is much stronger in the later parts of the game and is obviously a permanent buff. So generally speaking, the heralds are going to be much more valuable in almost every scenario if you have the choice on which to go for. However, it is very important to deny at least one dragon from the enemy so that they do not get the soul. So you generally want to try to prioritize, if you have the lead or you have the advantage, going for the heralds, but you need to make sure if you're doing this that you're then finding a way to deny one of the later dragons, which if you get the lead and you snowball shouldn't be too difficult in most scenarios. However, make sure that if you have a losing top laner, a losing Baron laner, but you have a winning dragon laner, that you play for the dragon, because you do want to play around your stronger side of the map most of the time. If you're losing in every part of the map, then just play for the objective that the jungler is not going for, because your goal is just to trade as much as possible. So basically, generally speaking, if you have the choice, go for the heralds, but you know, getting something's better than getting nothing, and generally you're still going to want to play around your stronger side of the map if it is at all possible. After that, we're going to now talk about invading a little bit. So when do you want to invade? Generally speaking, do not invade before your first clear. This is way too risky. There's just way too many unknown variables. Even if it's a really bad early game jungler and you're really, really good early game, unless you have like your laners already being like, yeah, let's do it. They're pinging you, you know they're going to go, and you have really, really strong early game. Just don't do it. It's going to be really risky. I just don't recommend it in terms of consistency. You do, however, want to invade oftentimes after getting a kill. If you see, for example, you get a kill and you know there's only one person who could possibly be on that side of the map, you might as well check their camps, see if they're up. If you have lane priority later on in the game, lane priority basically meaning your teammates have the lane pushed so they can go and help you quicker, and you have winning lanes, you're going to want to invade in those types of scenarios. Additionally, in terms of the dragon herald, say that you do trade, you get herald or dragon, doesn't matter, but let's just say you get herald in this scenario and the enemy get dragon. If they're still on the dragon, you can use that time to farm their top side of the map because they're going to be busy getting the dragon, and so use times where you're trading on the opposite side of the map to invade as well, because the enemy are going to be distracted and not really be able to do much for that. So just generally speaking, those are the main things in terms of Herald vs Dragon and in terms of when to invade. Okay, and then the next sort of thing is talking about the mid game. This is going to be after the first dragon / heralds have been taken. You're around that 7-8 minute mark, especially 7 minutes and 30 seconds when you now get full gold from the lanes, so you can start farming lanes more. Initially, your goal between first and second dragon spawn is to get as much gold as possible. Often that's going to be getting your second item most of the time. And one way to do this is to farm lanes when you can. So after you get a gank, you can start taking the gold because now it gives you enough gold. If you are losing already in the game, you can just farm the side lane instead of going for the second dragon and use that as a distraction. You can just focus on farming, and just generally, again, your goal is to get to that 2 item power spike alongside boots and gargoyle or whatever enchant you need, and then you're going to be strong for that dragon. And if you are strong for that dragon, you're going to play for that dragon, you're going to fight that dragon. If you're not strong for it, you're going to do the same thing up until the third dragon and then play for the third dragon. Obviously, if you already got the first dragon, you're going to want to play for the next 2 dragons to try to get soul. If you didn't get the first dragon, then you're going to want to just make sure you're denying one of the dragons, doesn't matter which. If the enemy has a dragon and you have a dragon, don't contest the third dragon unless you are ahead. If you're ahead, you can use it as a way to fight, but if you're behind, don't force it. Just farm, trade opposite side of the map, and let the enemy get it, because it basically doesn't mean anything at all. And then setting up for objectives, for dragons, for barons, for things like this. It's very important to note that you want to focus on lane priority in these scenarios. So make sure a minute before the objective is spawning, 30 seconds before it's spawning, you're aware of the fact that it is spawning and you're setting up for it. That's going to mean making sure you farm whatever you need to farm in order to hit the item that you need to hit. It's going to mean pushing the wave so that your team can then have access into the jungle first. It's going to mean sweeping around the objective wherever it is spawning so that you can then help your team out to push into and get vision there. All of these types of things are going to be how you're going to set up for dragons initially. And generally speaking, one other important thing to note when the Baron is spawning is that you want to start being spending much more time on the map on the Baron side. So whenever Baron spawns, apart from when dragons are obviously spawning as well, you're going to only spend your time on the opposite side of the Baron when you are farming your camps. But as soon as you're done farming those camps, immediately go back to the other side of the map, clear that side, and then stay on the Baron side, hover around the Baron side, and only go back to the other side when you know that the enemy can't sneak Baron and you need to farm your camps. But just generally, once the Baron's up, a lot more of your time is going to be spent there so that they can't randomly sneak it or anything from like that. Last couple things we're going to note, we're going to talk about playing from behind and ahead, and then we're going to talk about Baron and Elder. So the first thing is playing from behind. When you are behind in a game, it's generally very important as the jungler to trade the opposite side of the map and find whatever strong point you can. So again, say you do have one strong point, play for that strong point, and whenever you know the enemy jungler is on the opposite side of the map, really look to hard force and play around turrets or play around gold bounties to try to get some type of advantage there, even if you are losing overall. If all of your lanes are losing, then just permanently avoid the enemy jungler pretty much whenever you can. Focus on farming the opposite side of the map, take their camps, take their side when they're, overextending on one side, because they often are going to overextend. Play for turrets when you see a turret up. For example, if you have top lane turret is really low, but their bot lane turret's already dead, playing a little harder towards the top side there, because that's an actual turret, gives you additional gold, is something to focus on. Whereas when you're ahead, you're going to want to just kind of play a lot more, just farm, just play pretty safe, pretty standard, and then look for fights whenever you see you have a lot of people on the same side of the map. Really like stack that strong side and play around your strong points, and only really cover the side lanes of your weaker points in situations where you need to push the lane so that the enemy don't take an inhib or take a lot of your turrets or other things like that. But just generally speaking, when you're playing from ahead, you can be a bit safer and just take guaranteed plays. When you're playing from behind, you're going to trade opposite side a lot more and look for a bit more risky plays to potentially come back. And then in terms of playing around Baron and Elder late game. So in the late game, it's very important, one, when Elder is spawning, to make sure that you obviously are set up 30 seconds to a minute before the Elder spawning, around 17 minutes, 17 and a half minutes, you're ready for that Elder spawn, getting your items, getting set up for it as we spoke about. And then if you do get the Elder Dragon, use that Elder Dragon to force the Baron, and then once you have Baron and Elder Dragon, you use those two buffs to end. You're typically not going to be able to end with just Elder Dragon unless you hard win the fight, so don't overforce that. Make sure you're focusing on getting the Elder Dragon and then the Baron right after. And then in terms of using the Baron, if your team is all four going towards the mid, oftentimes try to focus on pushing a side lane so that you can have two lanes pushing rather than only one lane pushing. If your top laner is already pushing the side lane, then you can just hover around in the mid lane with the T-Rex or with the Baron buff if they do add back the regular Baron, but it's pretty much going to be the same way. Just generally speaking, in the late game, when you are playing around those objectives, make sure that you're focusing on getting the Elder and then using the Baron to end. Last thing for these two game-winning objectives of Baron and Elder, do not flip, which means do not try to just get it really low and smite it when the enemy jungler is alive if you're ahead. Because if you're ahead, you don't want to risk them potentially stealing, and you would rather force a fight around the objective. If you're behind, then you're really happy to just flip an objective if the enemy start it, or if you have an opportunity to start it, because you have a 50-50 chance of hitting it, which obviously if you were losing the game and you're behind, then if you have a 50-50 chance of getting the Baron or getting the Elder, that's going to up your odds of winning. But if you're having a 50-50 chance and you're already ahead, it's of course going to lower your chance of winning overall. So as a whole, that's about it for the jungle guide. I hope this was useful for you guys. I hope you enjoyed. As always, that is the final guide for the rules. Now I have all of the rule guides out. If you don't know, I do coaching for $15 an hour. Just DM me on Discord, Talon1169, or through the link in the description to my Discord server. You can join there and then just ping me in the server if you're interested. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video.